Okay, so I'm going to be responding to question number 3, which is in recent months, several major oil companies have announced plans to go carbon neutral in the coming decades, including BP. If you were an executive at BP responsible for lobbying the US government, what would be the single most compelling argument you can make to lawmakers to convince them to provide subsidies to ease your company's transition to carbon neutrality? So, after reading the article, there's a few facts that I would like to point out of the BP plan. One is that the CEO, Bernard Looney, said that the plan to move to net zero would cost trillions of dollars and that it would, quote, be reimagining energy as we know it. This is something that's very massive to American lawmakers, as a lot of them really don't like the idea of massive change and rapid change. So that's just something to note for later. Installation of equipment at all major BP oil and gas sites to measure methane emissions. That's something that is key to the plan. So that's going to be something that we touch upon when we talk about economic impact, but it's not as clear as, and as massive as cutting emissions that consumers would emit in the company's products. As the article says, that is a massive, probably the largest contributor to emissions by companies like BP. And the last thing that I think is important to note is that investment in non-oil and gas energy in the long term is something that BP is looking forward to. So that raises the question of what this would actually look like, and an idea versus a reality is something to keep in mind. So back to the question, it's really asking how can massive energy companies beyond BP get lawmakers to give them subsidies to help reduce their carbon footprints, and you can even take that a step further and say how can the government, meaning the public sector in general, not just the federal government but local and state governments, work with big industries in the private sector beyond just oil and gas companies, but also looking at companies like, in consulting industries or in finance that are not really, working to reduce their carbon footprint. How can they work together, the public and the private sector, to reduce the impact of climate change? So just a couple ideas that I have. So I think the way that you can actually get this done is kind of, as I implied earlier, emphasis on the economy. The reason why I say this is because I just don't think that the U.S. is, the way that it operates really is good for climate, NGOs and lobbyists to actually make their point. I think that governments need to have an angle on things in order for them to actually get stuff done. That this applies mostly to federal governments, not as much to local and state, but it definitely is true on all levels. And so I think that due to that, I think emphasizing that BP idea of, cutting emissions on the consumer end, I think that that's the most crucial part because nobody really stands to lose from production of cleaner energy. The environment will be cleaner, the carbon footprint will be reduced, and then both consumers and producers will be equally happy because nobody will be losing money, nobody will be paying, excess amounts in gas prices. At least that's the way that it seems on the surface. I'm no economist, but it seems as if that is a real thing to consider. Moreover, I think it's important to talk about how you could actually convince government officials that this will be good for the economy. So this is where I go back to that idea I was talking about before, installing equipment to reduce methane emissions, which is another thing that the article talks about. Here, you would actually be probably creating jobs. Engineers would be more well employed. And then you would also need both skilled and non-skilled workers to help installation of a lot of different things and to help these factories actually shift to net zero. So I think that that's a nice angle that the government could be convinced with. And so I think that's very key. I think another thing that we need to note is that the long-term investments in alternative energy need to be more specific and that governments need to work with companies like BP in order for them to actually achieve anything. So, if Congress has a committee that works with these companies, then creating a bill that subsidizes shift to cleaner energy or to net zero would be more likely to pass in both houses as there's a congressional committee that's working on it. So a practical real-life example of this would be the Congressional Committee for Energy and Commerce. So this goes back to my point about how the environment and the economy are intertwined. And due to the fact that the government needs an angle, the name Energy and Commerce was actually created. So this strengthens my point about how the government views the economy as being, one and the same as energy policy. So having executives of BP meet with the Committee on Energy and Commerce to draft a bill that subsidizes a shift towards net zero so that the economy remains stable and so that job creation occurs, but so also the plans are effectively put into place. Now, a counter argument, which is a valid argument in many aspects, but which I'll talk about why I don't believe in it nearly as much later, is just the practicality of, due to the practicality of everything. But that argument would be that an economic approach is not the most appropriate, and that BP should lobby based on environmental justice and on concerns for the long term of the country and the world and the planet. And I think that appealing to Congress and saying that BP could be the first major big business to do this and that all the other businesses will follow and that this can make the U.S. a global leader on climate change, I think that is the key of that argument. I think this is a good argument, but it really doesn't take into account the political lobbying and the Koch brothers, all these big lobbies that are going against reducing the carbon emissions and shifting to cleaner energy and towards net zero. So although this argument seems well-founded on the surface, it may not be grounded in the reality of the U.S. political system.